The words hit Olivia like a punch to the gut. "You're fired. Clear out your locker." For a second, she just stood there, frozen in place, apron strings still clutched in her hands. The cafe she had poured her heart into, the place she had built into more than just a coffee shop, had just been ripped away from her in an instant. The scent of freshly brewed espresso still lingered in the air. The quiet murmur of morning conversations had yet to resume. People sat at their usual spots, cups in hand, but no one moved. No one spoke. The weight of what had just happened settled over the room like a thick, suffocating fog. She felt the stares, some filled with shock, others with sympathy, but none of them spoke up. Not a single voice rose in protest. She had always known Harbor Brew was more than just a business. It was a place where people found comfort, where the past and present met over steaming mugs of coffee, where veterans like Ethan could sit without fear of judgment. For 6 years, Olivia had worked to create this sanctuary, a space where men and women who had given everything for their country could finally take a breath, let their guard down, and just exist. And now, because she had chosen to stand up for one of them, it was gone. Her fingers trembled as she pulled the apron over her head and set it on the counter, the fabric still warm from the morning rush. She turned toward Ethan. His posture was stiff, his grip on Ranger's harness too tight, his breathing shallow. She knew that look, the way his shoulders locked up, the slight tremor in his fingers. She had seen it before, in her father, in other men who had carried their battles home with them. She knew the words that were probably echoing in Ethan's mind, the insidious thoughts clawing their way in. Maybe I don't belong here. Maybe I really am a burden. Maybe I should just stop coming. She refused to let that happen. This is not your fault. Her voice was firm but quiet, just for him. You belong here. You always will. Ethan blinked, his throat bobbing as he swallowed hard. Ranger, ever attuned to his handler's distress, nudged his leg, grounding him. Olivia forced a small, steady smile. Then she turned, grabbed her bag from behind the counter, and walked out the door. The cold morning air hit her like a slap, sharp and unforgiving. The street outside was just as it had been when she arrived that morning, the world still moving as if nothing had changed. But for Olivia, everything had. She had no plan, no backup, no idea what to do next. All she knew was that she had done the right thing. And for now, that would have to be enough. The morning had started like any other. The rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, blending with the comforting hum of conversation. The espresso machine hissed, milk steamed, and the familiar faces of regulars settled into their usual seats. Olivia moved behind the counter with ease, already knowing what each customer wanted before they even reached the register. She had spent years learning their habits, the way Mr. Lanning always stirred his coffee 3 times before taking a sip, how Mrs. Patel needed extra foam, but only if she was staying to read, how Ethan always hesitated before ordering, as if the simple act of speaking still felt unfamiliar to him. But today, for once, he had come in without hesitation. He had walked straight to his usual spot by the window, Ranger at his side, and nodded to the other veterans sitting nearby. A small thing, but Olivia noticed. Every step of progress mattered. Then the voice cut through the warmth like a blade. Dogs aren't allowed in here. Health violation. The cafe fell silent. The steady hum of conversation, the rhythmic clinking of spoons against ceramic, the gentle whir of the coffee grinder, all of it ceased. Olivia turned, her stomach already sinking. Standing near the entrance, arms crossed over his chest, was Roger Mills. She had heard of him, the new health inspector, infamous among business owners for his unrelenting, almost obsessive enforcement of regulations. The kind of man who shut down establishments over minor infractions just to make a point. Now, his sharp gaze swept across the cafe like he was surveying a battlefield. Ethan sat frozen. His knuckles had gone white around Ranger's harness. His breathing had changed, shallow, uneven. Olivia knew that pattern, had seen it in her father too many times to count. Panic. Ranger, ever alert, pressed closer to Ethan's leg, his body solid and unmoving. The dog wasn't just there for comfort. He was there to keep his handler from slipping too deep into the spiral. But Roger Mills wasn't interested in understanding. He only saw rules. "I'm going to have to ask you to remove the animal," he said flatly, "or I'll have to shut this place down." Olivia stepped forward. "That's a service dog," she said, her voice even but firm. "He's protected under federal ADA law. Service animals are allowed in all public spaces." Roger scoffed, the corner of his mouth twitching in amusement. "Law or not," he said, waving a dismissive hand, "I don't want dog hair in people's food. Either the mutt leaves, or your cafe gets a temporary closure notice. Your call." Ethan flinched. Olivia saw the subtle way his shoulders tensed, the barely perceptible way his head ducked ever so slightly. The reaction wasn't to Roger's words. It was to the situation itself. The eyes, the attention, the feeling of being the reason for the problem. Her father had struggled with the same thing. The way he would shrink away from crowded places. The way he had avoided even simple trips to the grocery store because of the stares, the whispers, the casual dismissals from people who would never understand what he had gone through. She wasn't going to let that happen here. She planted her feet, locking eyes with Roger. "He has the right to be here," she said, her voice carrying across the silent cafe. Roger let out a slow, mocking chuckle. "I don't care about your so-called rights," he said, arms still crossed like a man who had already decided how this was going to end. "Here's my law. Either the dog leaves, or this place gets shut down." The silence in the cafe grew heavier, almost unbearable. No one moved. No one dared to breathe too loudly. Eyes flickered between Olivia and Roger, between Ethan and the door. Waiting to see who would back down first. Ethan's fingers twitched against Ranger's harness, the pressure of so many eyes on him taking its toll. The dog leaned into his leg, steady and unwavering. A low whimper rumbled in Ranger's throat. Not aggressive, not loud, just a reminder that he was there, that he was real. Panic had a way of making the world feel like a trap, tightening around a person until all they could hear was their own racing heartbeat, their own spiraling thoughts. Ranger was there to pull Ethan back before that could happen. And Olivia? She had spent years watching her father drown in those moments. She had spent years wishing someone had stood up for him. And now, she had a choice. She could let fear win. She could step aside, let Roger have his way, let Ethan walk out of here feeling like he was the problem. Or she could stand her ground. She tightened her jaw. She had already made her choice. "He stays." A new voice sliced through the tense air. "Olivia, stop." She turned, and the moment she saw her district manager standing there, she knew. His face was tight with barely concealed panic. His hands clenched at his sides like a man standing on the edge of something he didn't want to fall into. But it wasn't fear for Ethan. It wasn't fear for the veterans who had come to rely on this cafe as their sanctuary. It was fear for the business, for the bottom line, for himself. She had known him for years. He had been at her hiring interview, had signed off on the idea of Veterans Coffee Hour, had praised her for making the cafe a staple in the community. But none of that mattered now. She could see it in his eyes. Roger Mills stood off to the side, smug, arms still crossed as if he had already won. "You're forcing my hand," the manager said, shaking his head. His voice was quiet, but it carried, reaching every corner of the cafe. "If we fight this, we'll be shut down. I can't let that happen." He swallowed, jaw tightening before forcing out the words like they tasted bitter in his mouth. "You're fired." A single breath, a heartbeat, then silence. No one moved. No one spoke. Someone exhaled sharply, a muttered curse slipping from one of the veterans in the back. A chair scraped against the floor, but no one got up. No one stood in protest. They all saw what had just happened. And yet, no one stopped it. The weight of 6 years crashed down on her in an instant. 6 years of early mornings, of remembering every regular's order, of making sure that when a veteran walked through these doors, they felt safe. 6 years of building something that mattered. Gone, for doing the right thing. Her fingers trembled as she reached behind her back, untied her apron, and pulled it over her head. The fabric was soft, warm, familiar in a way that made her chest ache. She placed it on the counter with slow, deliberate movements. Then she turned to Ethan. His face was blank, unreadable, but she knew what was happening beneath the surface. She knew the spiral, the creeping thoughts, the slow descent into doubt. She had watched it happen to her father. Maybe I am a burden. Maybe I really don't belong here. No, she wasn't going to let that thought take root. This is not your fault. Her voice was quiet but steady, a foundation to hold on to. You belong here. A beat. You always will. Ethan blinked. His throat moved as he swallowed hard, and for a second, she thought he might say something. But he didn't need to. Ranger pressed against his leg, a silent anchor. And Olivia knew that, for now, that was enough. She turned without another word, grabbed her bag from behind the counter, and walked toward the door. No one stopped her. She stepped outside. The air was cold, sharper than it had been that morning. The sky was the same pale blue, the streets still busy with people going about their day, completely unaware that her entire world had just shifted beneath her feet. She stood there for a moment, staring at the horizon, unsure of what to do next. No backup plan, no savings cushion. Rent was due next week. For the first time, the price of doing the right thing felt crushingly, terrifyingly real. And yet, she straightened her shoulders, inhaled deeply, and forced herself to keep walking. She had lost everything, but she had done the right thing. And somehow, in the back of her mind, she clung to the hope that it still mattered. The world outside the cafe felt different. Too bright, too cold, too indifferent. Olivia's hands clenched the strap of her bag as she stood on the sidewalk, staring at nothing in particular. The weight of what had just happened pressed against her chest, but she refused to let it settle. She had done the right thing. So why did it feel like the loneliest moment of her life? A low rumble stirred in the distance. Faint at first, then growing. Deep, steady, rhythmic. It wasn't the sound of passing traffic or the occasional motorcycle roaring down the road. It was heavier. It was deliberate. She lifted her head. Engines. Not one, not two, dozens. The vibrations rolled through the pavement, through her bones, through the very air around her. People on the sidewalk turned, their conversations faltering, their eyes widening as the sound drew closer. And then, as if the universe had shifted just slightly, Olivia saw them. Rows of vehicles lined up in perfect formation, engines idling, the sun catching on polished metal and crisp uniforms. Men and women stood beside them, shoulders squared, feet planted firmly against the asphalt, their expressions unreadable but watching. At the front of them all, walking toward the cafe doors with the confidence of a man who had commanded battlefields, was Colonel Nathan Pierce. Olivia's breath caught in her throat. She knew that name. Everyone who had ever been connected to the military knew that name. But for her, it was something more. He had been her father's commanding officer, the last man to speak to him before his final deployment. Her feet felt rooted to the pavement as he approached, his eyes locking onto hers with the kind of steadiness that made lesser men shift uncomfortably. But Olivia didn't move. She wouldn't. He stopped in front of her, saying nothing at first, simply studying her with the quiet weight of someone who understood far more than he let on. Then, without a word, he extended his hand. She hesitated, just for a second. Then she took it. His grip was firm, unshaking, the kind of handshake that meant something. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, calm, but carried a weight that settled deep into her chest. "We've been looking for you." Her pulse skipped. "What?" Behind him, the Marines remained still, their presence a silent, unwavering wall. Whatever this was, it wasn't just about her. Pierce nodded toward the cafe, toward the silent figures standing inside. Her district manager, the health inspector, the stunned faces of customers who had watched her get fired and said nothing. "Do you know what happens when you stand up for the right people?" he asked. She swallowed, unsure how to respond. He didn't wait for an answer. "You find out who's willing to stand up for you." The words landed heavier than she expected. Before she could process them, another voice called her name. She turned. Ethan. He stood near the entrance of the cafe, his stance still slightly guarded, but something was different. He wasn't shrinking. He wasn't fading into the background. And he wasn't alone. More veterans had gathered behind him. Men and women who had once come into Harbor Brew for the comfort of familiarity, who had sat at their usual tables, weary from battles most people would never see. Some she barely knew. Others she had watched change, little by little, With each cup of coffee, each conversation, each quiet moment of being understood. Her throat tightened. "What is all this?" she finally asked, her voice quieter than she intended. Pierce let out a small chuckle, not unkind. "Someone filmed what happened," he said. "A customer." It made its way to the base. A chill ran down her spine. The entire base saw it. She didn't know what to say. And beyond that, he continued, his eyes flicking back toward the cafe where Roger Mills and her district manager still stood, pale as ghosts. "It's viral." The air in her lungs suddenly felt different. The higher-ups saw it. The command saw it. And let's just say, his lips twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile, but close. "Some people are in serious trouble." She turned, her gaze locking onto the men inside. The ones who had fired her without a second thought. The ones who had let it happen without lifting a finger. And for the first time, they weren't the ones in control. She looked back at Pierce, still trying to make sense of what was happening. "They fired me," she said, more to herself than to him. The words felt strange now, like they didn't hold the same weight they had just minutes ago. Pierce's expression didn't change. "Yes, they did." A pause. "But now you have options." Her brows furrowed. "What do you mean?" His stance shifted slightly, the authority in his presence never faltering. "We've been looking for someone to head our Veterans Outreach Program," he said. "Someone who understands both customer service and what it means to fight for what's right. Someone who can help service members transition back into civilian life." He met her gaze, and this time, it wasn't just the weight of a commander speaking to a civilian. It was an offer. "We need someone like you." The words slammed into her. A job, but not just any job. A mission, something that mattered. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Pierce must have seen the turmoil flicker across her face because he gave a small nod, almost like reassurance. "Take your time, Carter." He turned slightly, motioning toward the group of veterans still standing near the cafe. "But just so you know," he said, "you already have an entire army behind you." The weight of those words settled deep in her chest. He wasn't just talking about the men and women in uniform. She looked at Ethan again, at the way he stood a little taller, at the way he nodded at her, as if silently telling her that she had done the right thing. The right thing. And when you did the right thing, even when it cost you everything, sometimes the world had a way of giving back. Her fingers trembled slightly as she exhaled. Her voice was steadier than she expected when she finally spoke. "Where do I start?" The words felt foreign in her mouth. "They fired me." It didn't feel real yet. It had only been minutes since she walked out of Harbor Brew, but already it felt like a lifetime ago. The smell of coffee, the hum of conversation, the worn wooden counter she had stood behind for 6 years. It was all still there, just beyond the glass doors, but it wasn't hers anymore. Colonel Pierce didn't hesitate. "Yes," he said, his voice calm, assured. "They did." Then, with the same certainty, he added, "But you do have a job." Olivia blinked. It took a second for the words to register, for her mind to process the shift. A job? She didn't have a job. That was the whole point. Pierce studied her for a moment before continuing. "We've been looking for someone to lead our Veterans Outreach Program. Someone who understands not just the policies and procedures, but the people. Someone who knows what it means to fight for them when no one else will." Her chest tightened. This wasn't some empty consolation. This wasn't pity. This was an offer. Not just any job. Not another cafe. Not another place to take orders and keep a business running. A mission. Something that mattered. The weight of it pressed against her ribs. "You want me to?" She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "I don't have a degree in social work. I'm not a counselor. I was a cafe manager." Pierce finished for her. "Yes, a cafe manager who built a safe space for veterans. A cafe manager who fought harder for them than most people in this country ever have. A cafe manager who didn't just see them as customers, but as human beings worth standing up for." She had no response to that. Because he was right. Pierce shifted, glancing back at the men and women still standing behind him. "You already know how to do the most important part of this job. The rest? We'll teach you." Something inside her cracked. For so long, she had believed her work at Harbor Brew was small. She had convinced herself that all she had done was pour coffee, offer a place to sit, and listen when no one else would. but it hadn't been small, and it sure as hell hadn't been meaningless. She thought of Ethan, of the way he had slowly learned to sit at a table instead of standing near the door, of the way Ranger had curled at his feet while he whispered small pieces of his story to the men who understood. She thought of her father, the nights he had spent sitting at the kitchen table in silence, a beer clutched in his hand, staring at nothing. The moments when he needed someone, anyone, to remind him that he wasn't alone. If she had been able to make a difference in a coffee shop, what could she do with real resources? Her fingers tightened around the strap of her bag. She swallowed. Where do I start? The words were barely above a whisper, but Pierce heard them. His lips twitched. Not quite a smile, but something close. Follow me. Her first day on the job. The office was smaller than she expected. Tucked inside the military base, past layers of security, past men and women in uniform who barely glanced at her as she walked by. There was no espresso machine steaming in the background, no scent of fresh coffee curling through the air. This wasn't Harbor Brew. This was something else entirely. Her desk was simple, just a sturdy wooden table, a filing cabinet, and a chair that creaked when she sat down. A few binders were stacked neatly in the corner, filled with policies, veteran resources, and endless paperwork that she barely knew how to navigate yet. She exhaled slowly. She had stepped into a world she hadn't been trained for. A world where she wasn't just helping veterans find a place to sit and feel safe. She was helping them rebuild their lives. It was overwhelming, and it was exactly where she needed to be. The work that needed to be done. Her days blurred into long hours of meetings, research, and real conversations with veterans who had been left behind. She met men and women who had spent years in the military, only to return home and feel like they didn't belong anywhere. Some needed job training. Some needed mental health support that the system had failed to give them. Some, like Ethan, just needed someone to see them. She fought for every single one of them. She pushed for therapy services to be expanded, for businesses to hire more veterans, for housing programs to include more resources for those struggling with PTSD. But her biggest battle came in the form of something she never thought she'd have to fight for. Service dogs. The battle for service animals. She saw it immediately. The way some officers glanced at Ranger when Ethan visited her office. The way paperwork complicated the process of allowing veterans to bring their dogs onto military bases. One administrator had the nerve to tell her, military bases aren't pet-friendly. She had stared at him for a long moment, then said, without flinching, they're not pets. They're soldiers, and they deserve the same respect. It took weeks of pushing, endless meetings, one particularly heated argument with a general who thought she was being overly emotional about the issue. But in the end, she won. A dedicated space on base was established for veterans with service animals, a place where they could train, rest, and exist without judgment. The first time she walked into that space and saw Ethan sitting with Ranger, laughing with another veteran instead of keeping his head down, she felt something shift inside her. This was working. This mattered. And for the first time in months, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. Ethan stood at the edge of the stage, gripping the microphone in both hands. His knuckles were white, his shoulders tight, his breath just a little too shallow. For a moment, Olivia thought he might walk away. 6 months ago, he wouldn't have been able to do this. 6 months ago, the mere idea of standing in front of a room full of people, hundreds of eyes watching him, would have sent him straight for the nearest exit. But now he was here. The room was packed. Military officials, business owners, veterans. The Veterans Integration Conference was one of the most important events of the year, a place where decision-makers and policy leaders gathered to talk about the future of service members transitioning into civilian life. And Ethan Parker, the man who had once barely been able to order a cup of coffee without shaking, was standing at the podium, preparing to speak. Olivia sat near the front, watching as he inhaled sharply, steadied himself, and began. "My name is Ethan Parker," he said, voice low but firm. "And I never thought I'd be standing here." Silence. No whispers. No shifting in seats. No murmurs of side conversations. Just listening. because every single person in that room knew what it took for a man like Ethan to stand in front of them now. He told them his story, about the isolation, the panic, the way the world outside of the military had felt too big, too loud, too disconnected. He told them about the day he walked into Harbor Brew for the first time, hands shaking, hoodie pulled low, Ranger pressed close against his leg. He told them about Olivia, about how she had made sure he always had a place to sit, about how she had seen him when so many others had just looked away. And then he told them about the moment everything changed. The confrontation, the health inspector, the way Olivia had stood between him and the man who thought rules were more important than people, the way she had lost her job for it. He paused, glancing down at the stage for just a moment, gathering himself. When he lifted his head again, his voice was stronger. But because of that, he said, because of what she did, everything is different now. He gestured toward the crowd, toward the representatives from the outreach program, toward the people who had gathered here to make real changes for veterans like him. Because of one act of courage, he continued, I'm not just surviving anymore. I have a purpose. I have a community. And I know that I'm not alone. His voice cracked slightly on the last word, but it didn't matter. The room erupted in applause. People stood. Military officers, high-ranking officials, business leaders who had spent their careers in suits and boardrooms. They were all on their feet. Ethan took a small step back from the microphone, his hands still shaking, but now it wasn't from fear. It was from something else. Pride. Olivia exhaled slowly, blinking back the heat behind her eyes as she stood with the rest of them. Because if there had ever been a moment that defined everything, it was this one. This was what it had all led to. This was why she had walked out of Harbor Brew with nothing but her principles and the fire in her chest telling her that she had done the right thing. And she had. The work that still needed to be done. The conference was just the beginning. The outreach program had grown in ways no one had expected, but Olivia wasn't done yet. She started training businesses on ADA compliance, making sure no veteran was ever turned away again simply because they had a service dog. She expanded mental health resources, creating direct partnerships with therapists who specialized in PTSD treatment. She worked with hiring managers, pushing for companies to actively recruit and train veterans instead of just giving them empty reassurances. And slowly, step by step, veteran by veteran, things started to change. But the moment that truly brought everything full circle came one afternoon, months after the conference, in a place she never expected. A cafe, not Harbor Brew, a different one, just a few blocks from the base. She had stopped in for a meeting with the owner, someone who had reached out about training for his staff. She barely noticed the warm scent of espresso, the quiet hum of conversation, the background noise that had once been her entire world. Until she heard it, a voice hesitant but firm. Sorry, sir, but dogs aren't allowed inside. Health code policy. She turned. At the counter, a young barista, probably no older than 20, stood stiffly, his face pale as he spoke to the man in front of him, a veteran wearing a faded military jacket. At his side, a golden retriever sat patiently, a vest clearly marking him as a service animal. Olivia felt something tighten in her chest. The scene was painfully familiar. She didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on the barista's shoulder. Let me explain something to you, she said, her voice calm but firm. The young man blinked at her, startled. She turned toward the veteran, offering a warm smile. Sir, you're welcome here, she said. And so is your service dog. The veteran hesitated, clearly caught off guard by the sudden shift. Then, after a moment, he nodded slowly. She glanced back at the barista, who still looked uncertain. I know you're just following the rules you were given, she said. But federal law states that service animals are not pets. They're essential medical support. They're allowed in public places, including restaurants and cafes. The young man swallowed. I didn't know that. That's why I'm here, Olivia said, smiling. To make sure people do. The cafe owner, having overheard the exchange, stepped in with an apologetic nod. We'll get that training set up right away, Miss Carter. I appreciate you stepping in. She nodded, glancing back at the veteran. Can I get you a cup of coffee? For a moment, the man hesitated. Then, slowly he smiled. "That'd be great," he said. She exhaled, something settling inside her. This was why. Because once, she had been fired for standing up for a veteran and his service dog. Now, she was the reason it wouldn't happen again. A simple truth. Later that day, she sat in her office, her own office, at Veterans Outreach Headquarters. Photos lined the walls. Veterans who had found jobs. Families who had been reunited. Men and women who had once been on the edge, but had found their way back. And right behind her desk, hanging where she could always see it, was a single framed photograph. Her father. Beneath it, a plaque. "When you stand up for what's right, the right people will stand up for you." She smiled. She finally understood. Courage comes at a cost. Sometimes it costs comfort. Sometimes it costs security. And sometimes it costs everything. Olivia had learned that firsthand. She had walked into Harbor Brew that morning as a manager. Someone who had spent years pouring coffee, remembering orders, making sure veterans had a place where they felt seen, understood, welcome. She had walked out with nothing. Or so she thought. In reality, she had walked out with something far greater. Because standing up for what was right, even when it cost her, had set off a chain reaction that changed not just her life, but the lives of countless others. One act of courage. One choice to say no. This isn't right. And because of that choice, veterans who had spent years feeling unseen, unwanted, and discarded found a voice, found a place, found hope. One person standing up had given others the strength to do the same. Ethan, the man who had once shrunk into the shadows, who barely spoke, who carried the weight of his past like a burden too heavy to bear. He stood on a stage and told his story to hundreds. Veterans who had been turned away from businesses because of their service animals. They had Olivia fighting for them, ensuring that never happened again. Companies that had overlooked hiring former service members. They were now working with the Veterans Outreach Program, bringing them in, giving them opportunities. One act of courage. One moment of choosing to fight instead of backing down. And the ripple effect was still spreading. So the question is, what happens when you stand up for what's right? The world tells us that it's easier to stay quiet, to avoid confrontation, to tell ourselves that someone else will step up. But what if that someone else is supposed to be you? What if, in that moment, you are the only person standing between what is right and what is easy? Has there ever been a moment when you had to stand up for something that mattered? A time when you spoke up, even when it was difficult? Or maybe there was a time someone stood up for you, when someone fought for you, protected you, refused to let the world push you aside. If you have a story, share it. Because stories like these matter. Because voices like yours matter. And because the world needs more people willing to say, no, this isn't right, and I won't let it happen. If you believe in voices that challenge injustice, in stories that inspire action, subscribe. Because here, we don't just tell stories. We create movements. Are you ready to be part of something bigger?